I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and for the last few years, I haven't been confused with Martin Bashir, because he's been in America, but I'm delighted by the news that he's coming back. So Brexit, bring it on, means Brexit, bring it on. And so I don't know what we're going to talk about for the next 40 minutes, but I have a brilliant panel to go through the issues, and the issues obviously are, what are we going to do? What does it mean? Are we going to leave the single market? What happens if we do? Will you all have to move to Berlin? And what are the private schools like in Berlin? So with me on this panel are Lord Mandelson, former, eminent cabinet minister, did various jobs, and of course was first secretary and the sort of the brains behind the Blair and Brown project, also a former European commissioner, and is now chair of Global Council, his own international strategic advisory company. Josh Berger is president and managing director of Warner Brothers UK, Ireland and Spain, and also chair of the BFI. And John McVay is the chief executive of PACT. So to kick us off with what we're going to be talking about, we have a film in a moment, but before we play that, can I just encourage you to download the RTS app. If you go to Google Play or iTunes, please download the RTS app, because at the end of this session, which I hope will be a bit more interactive than the last one in terms of your questions, because I've only got 3, we'll be asking you to vote on a couple of things that will be quite interesting. So if you could go and download that and make sure you've got it on your phone, and in the meantime, run the film. Peter, can I start with you in terms of the bigger picture and the kind of deal Britain should be angling for and might get? Because in the 3 months since the morning of the referendum, where you were looking rueful on the green outside the House of Commons.
Heartbroken.
Heartbroken then. We've gone from an assumption that there would have to be some sort of deal in which we remain part of the single market, and yet there is some sort of deal on freedom of movement, freedom of movement ends, to now even Labour senior figures talking about, well, if we can't get a deal on freedom of movement, then we've just got to forget about the single market. Is hard Brexit now looking like the real future?
More likely than not, but not inevitably so. And in my view, as time goes on, both the UK side and the EU side will realise that mutually assured destruction is not a sensible outcome of this divorce, of this demerger, and that they've got to find something which is more proportionate, a compromise, a more middle road that accommodates the interests of both. I mean, look, at the moment, we have not the faintest idea, because the government is still negotiating with itself. It hasn't begun negotiating with anyone else, and that won't be the case until sometime next year. And in a sense, we should draw encouragement from the fact that behind the appearance of calm and behind those closed Whitehall doors, there is tremendous turmoil going on. Now, I derive some encouragement from that, because positions and different approaches are still being contested within government. And government will, though, have to choose whether it's going to go the doctrinaire route, I mean the sort of clean, quick break as firmly as possible and out as quickly as possible and as far away from the rest of them as possible, or the more pragmatic approach, which inevitably I favour, which could result in our creating an entirely new, positive, sort of cooperative relationship, spanning all areas of economic and other activity between ourselves and the Europeans, or whether the government's just going to say, look, there's only one show in town. It's freedom of movement. We've got to stop it at all costs, and everything else can go hang. And as you say, because of the sort of advent, I mean, the sort of revolution almost in identity politics that we saw engulfing the country during the course of the referendum, affecting not just the Conservatives, but Labour too, as you say, there are many, many politicians who are so running scared of freedom of movement that they are showing signs of being prepared to sacrifice any national economic interest, investment, job, skill, future source of employment or whatever, just to meet the public's concern over freedom of movement. I don't dismiss that concern, by the way, it's real. Remember, my constituency was Hartlepool in the northeast of England. They didn't vote Remain. So I understand what is going on, but simply to arrive at a position where people are saying, let's throw all the rules up in the air and it doesn't matter where they land as long as we don't have freedom of movement, it would be, in my view, taking Britain to hell in a handcart.
And how long do you think this limbo is going to go on? I mean, Theresa May's obviously under pressure within her own party to do something quick in terms of Article 50. But is that, given that there are French presidential elections, German elections next year, is there any point doing
understand why she's under pressure to do things quickly. They don't want a more sensible, pragmatic middle road emerging. The people you're talking about are the quick, clean break hardliners in the cabinet. So the last thing they want is for some rather more qualified or hard to negotiate outcome in all this. They don't want the sort of, positive cooperative partnership. That's not where they're at. They're in a completely different space. And they fear that, with every month that passes in which Article 50 is not triggered, clever civil servants are going to come up with some more sensible alternative for the country. And they don't want it.
Josh, you're going to have to move, aren't you, if this happens?
I'm a British citizen, so I think not, actually. But what's your other question?
Well, let's assume that we're no longer part of the single market, that the hardliners get their view, that the pressure for some sort of hard Brexit is irresistible, or that Europe just doesn't give way on freedom of movement. So what does that mean for businesses like yours that have channels that are based here, that are broadcasting into Europe?
There are three main areas this falls into. We saw them in the video. The first is talent and freedom of movement and the ability for the creative industries to attract world-class talent, whether from Europe or abroad. We make lots of movies and television shows here. We employ many non-Europeans. Obviously, it's much easier for Europeans to work here because it's not an issue. And the reason why our creative industries are as strong as they are today is that, and really world leading, is based on the fact that we attract talent from all over the world. But in particular, from Europe. The visual effects industry, the animation industry, there are productions where you have a majority of Europeans working in those shows. Movies that we make, lesser, but again, very critical, very highly skilled talent, which make this fantastic kind of collection of productions that we churn out as an industry here. So the ability to continue to attract talent and have them come here with some certainty that they can work here, that they aren't going to be subject to impossible visa restrictions, that is critical, and that will be part of that negotiation. Whether hard Brexit means that the result of that negotiation with the Europeans is that it's going to be very, very difficult for us to attract Europeans to work here, which is something that sounds hard to imagine, but it's a possibility. If that happens, it will not be a positive for the creative industries. There's no question about it. Hopefully, we will find a better solution, as Peter said, and that good sense and common sense will prevail in that. The country of origin principle is the other major issue facing us, which is for broadcasters. And again, based on that negotiation, if we can continue to license through Ofcom the broadcasters that are here, there are like 1,100 broadcasters that are licensed here, and many of them to target the European market. if those licenses are no longer useful, and that is something that is conceivable, then those broadcasters will have to move onto the continent to license their broadcasters through an acceptable European agency. Again, that's another issue that's going to be negotiated, and we have a whole thriving industry that employs thousands of people in the, if you will, the European broadcasting segment. And then there are the monies that Rebecca referred to in the video that go to producers today in film and television and animation from Creative Europe. And those funds are about £28 million worth of basically direct funding and subsidies that go to British producers. Again, if we stay in as part of Creative Europe, then we will continue to enjoy that. It's imaginable that that will be a difficult thing to do. So I would suggest that the government understand that we're going to have to continue to spend those monies because they're very critical.
And they haven't said anything about that, have they?
They haven't said anything. I mean, I'm not sure that they really got, I don't think they have their head around those issues just yet. That is fairly in the weeds, I think, at this stage. But that's something, and part of today, hopefully, is to make sure that the people who will go in to negotiate this deal, as it relates to the creative industries, they are fully briefed on what are the hot topics to negotiate.
So if you can't have talent freely moving into London, and if your channels have to move somewhere onto the continent for regulatory purposes, I mean, you do have to move, don't you? Even if you're a British citizen.
Yes, I'm staying here, by the way. I just want you to know right now. It is possible that channels, if you cannot license in London or in Britain for a European network, you will have to locate people in Europe to get a European license.
And this is a huge issue, isn't it? I mean, about half the channels broadcasting into Europe are licensed through London.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's probably going to go, isn't it?
Welcome to the world of Brexit. I mean, you're talking about one very, very large, very economically significant sector for our country. But there are thousands of different sectors and segments of interest within different sectors of our economy that the government is going to have to address. So the fundamental issue is, I mean, for trade in goods, the most fundamental issue is, do we want to maintain as greater continuity in the substantial part of our trade as we can possibly achieve outside the European Union? And if the answer to that question is yes, an awful lot of other questions flow from that, like, are we going to remain in the customs union for goods that would enable us to maintain a tariff-free free trade between Britain and the European Union? It has certain other questions, implications arising from whether we choose to stay in the customs union, but that's pretty basic. But that's for goods. For services, you're really talking about replacing our existing membership of the single market by a plethora of different agreements. I mean, many, many, many different agreements, whether it be audiovisual or flying rights, you name it. I mean, there are very few sectors in our economy that are not directly or indirectly European-facing or have European regulatory practices bear on that economic activity. So the government is going to have to decide over how many areas and to what extent is it going to try to negotiate agreements that maintain the present trade and links between Britain and the European Union, and to what extent in negotiating that access and that continuation of trade, it's prepared to take on the costs and the conditions of that. And one of those main conditions, as we know, is free movement. And if you are a member of the government who says, no, at all costs, free movement is it, ending that is the priority, then basically every other domino falls.
John, I mean, at the moment, whenever I interview people like you on the news, everyone's kind of saying, well, it's not as bad as we thought. You know, the sky hasn't fallen in. You know, the economics isn't a disaster. at the moment. You're compiling a report, I know, on what you want, what your industry wants out of Brexit.
Yep.
What is the mood of your industry at the moment?
Well, I was asked to do a report for government by the Creative Industries Council, which we're doing with the Creative Industries Federation. So that's looking at the role of the creative industries in the UK economy. The issues that have been raised, country of origin, freedom of movement, are some of the key issues for the audiovisual sector, but across other sectors as well. That work's ongoing. It's involved the entire UK creative industries. I think the main objective is to make sure the creative industries actually forms a central part, as Peter says, of this government's recognition of how important we are to the UK economy. We're 9% of GDP. We are a net exporter both to Europe and the rest of the world in many of our goods and services. But currently we're not part of this government's industrial strategy. So I think the first objective is to get us on the table. The second objective is to then work through the issues that affect our industries and the viability going forward. One of those key ones, and I try and use language which is a sort of post-referendum language. Freedom of movement is a sort of pre-referendum. So access to global talent, I think, is very important. Not just the EU, because actually one of the key things for the creative industries is it's not just EU citizens. Okay, it's easier for EU citizens, but actually we attract talent from around the globe, from the Indian continent, from America, Canada. All of those people want to come to the UK and to our creative industries because we have one of the most vibrant, innovative economies. And the fact that we do have that blend and that mix, we've pulled off a little trick, which is where we get to work with the best in the world, and that makes us the best in the world. So, and that's been to our economic and creative benefit.
How many calls have you had from Whitehall or from ministers asking you to feed into their negotiations?
Well, we've been asked formally to do this. We don't know what the negotiation is. We don't know when it starts. We don't know what form it takes. We don't know how the key issues are going to be flushed out. That's all happening in Whitehall. I think what we're trying to do is make sure that the things that we care about, which are important to our continuing economic success in the short, medium and long term, are properly understood, and that we do get a seat at the table where the creative industries, and I'd encourage everyone...
But what is your route to that? I mean, is it dealing with Karen Bradley? Or,
yes,
and then was she supposed to get an appointment with Philip Hammond?
We're doing a report for DCMS and DIT, as it's now called. That will be going to Secretary of State's later in October, and then they'll be attending a meeting of the creative industries to discuss that at the end of October. I don't think they're going to say, job done, and this is what we're going to do. And I think it's important for everyone who cares about the UK's creative industries that you take every opportunity to raise this with any interactions with government, that we should be at the top table and we shouldn't be seen, because if we're not at the top table, what happens is we become a tradable commodity in the forthcoming negotiation. The French Producers Association may not be too delighted that we're selling most of our TV programming into their market. They may be suggesting to their politicians that there might be some trade barriers or tariffs introduced so that we take up less of their time and take less of their money.
It's the same for financial services or cars or auto components. I mean, people say, the Europeans need us more than we need them. Well, actually, there are many sectors on the continent who wouldn't half mind getting a hold of a greater market share, whether it be in audiovisual or auto components or financial services or whatever it is. So we will be negotiating once we've made up our mind what the goal is in this negotiation, whether we're going to go, as I say, the doctrinaire route or the more pragmatic middle road one. We will be negotiating not just with 27 other countries and their economic interests, but sectors within those economies, all of which are going to take different views of the extent to which they want Britain to continue to be integrated or to have our producers marginalised. So for this industry, the entire Brexit is the most complex policy exercise mounted in peacetime. I mean, transitioning Britain out of its current merger with 27 other economies is a massive task, and it's going to take many years. So what you as an industry have got to do is, first of all, take a view on what sort of negotiating outcome you want, what sort of relationship best serves your needs? Is it close or far away? Secondly, you've got to engage in a great deal of very, very competitive advocacy. So is your industry going to be high up in the negotiating pecking order, or is it going to be too low down for your interests to be addressed in the way that you want? And thirdly, when it comes to accessing global talent, as we now must call it, you're facing another great competition because sitting at the heart of government in the Home Office in Whitehall will be a team of people flicking through, and I'm talking many years down the road, visa applications. They're going to be choosing and selecting. Now, what sort of people do we want coming here? At the moment, the people who tend to get the visas are people who are relatively very high paid because they are thought to be people whose skills are scarce and who we have to compete in order to get, and therefore one way of competing is to use the visa system in order to bring here. That would be a disaster, in my view, for your industry. I mean, basically, it would put in the hierarchy of visa allocations, sort of financial services up here, and where your potential employees and the skills you want access to are relatively less well rewarded, on the basis of the current system, you will be way down the hierarchy. So you've got to create a map, if you like, which is going to take you from here to 5+ years' time, in which you're going to be lobbying the government for one general sort of relationship outcome you want. Secondly, in the hierarchy of sectoral interests, you want yourselves up here, but there'll be others jostling with you for that position. And then you will want to be lobbying very, very hard indeed to get the access to skills system working in a way that isn't immediately prejudiced or loaded against your industry's needs.
I mean, Josh, what we want to try and get out of this session is a sense of priorities. We're going to ask you to rank in order of importance, some of these different issues, whether it's what was it, access to global talent? Mm-hmm. We've called it free movement of labour. Country of origin principle, UK content counting towards EU production quotas, advertising regulation. I mean, do you, and we'll come on to the digital single market in a moment, but what is your top priority? If Philip Hammond sits down and says, what's the most important thing that I've got to get for your industry?
As a producer, talent. I mean, very simply, actually. Access to talent, access to global talent, right? And Europeans, because right now, I mean, nothing's changed for outside of the EU. We are already dealing in the scenario that Peter described. So the issue becomes about European talent. So that's the top issue as a producer. As a broadcaster, country of origin. As a European broadcaster. And then, I mean, they're all important issues, but that is the hierarchy.
One of the things, John, I mean, Britain risks losing is it will lose because it's coming out, but it will lose its voice in terms of European negotiations, particularly in terms of the digital single market. What is the potential impact of losing our voice there?
Well, I'm not sure the British government had a particularly useful voice in the first place, given that it's done very little to effectively oppose the introduction of the regulations that the European Commission are bringing in on the digital single market. Just 2 weeks ago, the Commission published new regulations which will extend country of origin to free VOD services, which will effectively give European broadcasters, and including UK broadcasters if they so wish, cross-border rights on VOD services. And that potentially diminishes the potential value we get for selling our property by territory. So this is the cross-border access, which they said they wouldn't do, but they're sort of doing it through the back door by saying, oh, well, we're not making you do it, but if you're a German broadcaster and you have a VOD service and you wanted to extend that VOD service into Austria, you can now do it under country of origin, where previously you would have to have licensed your VOD service through the Austrian system, prohibition, there's difficulties on that. You'd have to take on their local production criteria and anything else they wanted at a local level. So that could potentially damage our sales into Europe, where we sell to a French broadcaster who has a VOD service which now goes into Germany. Well, the German broadcaster may not think that's very good and want to pay me a bit less when I sell my programme into that territory. So by the back door, they've introduced this, and I've been in to see the government with Josh's colleagues and many others to try and get our government to play in that game a lot more strongly than they have been, but just now, just to get in the room and be present in the discussions. And I fear that because of the hiatus around Brexit, that the UK is now seen as not being a significant player when we are the biggest net exporter into that market, and we should be actually still having a voice in those debates.
That's the problem, isn't it? I mean, how does the British industry still have a voice? And why would they take us seriously?
Well, they're not. I mean, Britain. The day after the vote, Britain was effectively marginalised. I mean, it's just a fact of life, I'm afraid. Because people are talking in the European Commission or the European Parliament or the Council about, this initiative or that new project or this new piece of legislation, or how the Audiovisual Services Media Directive is going to be completely revamped. And that, as you know, is the subject of a further report that has appeared this week, driven by two rapporteurs of the relevant committee in the European Parliament, German, by the way, with very strong German national interests, one a social democrat, the other centre-right, driving this car very fast down the legislative track. Now, I doubt very much whether the UK industry would be entirely happy with the direction in which those two German rapporteurs would like to take all this legislation. Yeah, well, I'd be surprised.
We're generally unhappy with the whole European Commission on this legislation.
Right, of the whole directive, you mean?
Most of the directive is a threat to our territorial licensing.
So the question is, if you take John's view, perhaps it would be as well for Britain to leave the European Union, and then we could have that sort of freedom, that policy freedom, that policy autonomy, and we would no longer be bound by this.
Yeah, no, but we would be bound by selling into it. That's the problem.
Which was the second point I was going to make. You will never escape it, unless you simply want to trade with yourselves in this country. And the same goes for financial services, the same goes for every other economic sector. The point is that our economy, Krish, after 40 years of close progressive integration, our economy has become almost entirely reshaped around the opportunities offered by Europe's 500 million single market. I'm not saying that we don't know about or care about the rest of the world. There's a bloody great market on the other side of the Atlantic, which we care a great deal about. But we're talking about nearly half our trade in this one European market, which is our home market. So you're talking about potentially loss of access, loss of funding, loss of access to talent, and loss of influence over regulation, which even though you're outside the European Union, you will still be exposed to because you're offering services to that market, and therefore you will be exposed to European regulation. And you say, John, the British government has had no influence over it. I'm sorry to hear that. And I'm not entirely sure why that is the case, why it hasn't been a priority.
I can give you my thesis.
For the British government, whether they've traded an interest in this directive for, from their point of view, more important interests in other directives.
I think it was a lot to do with getting something sorted out with the Commission pre the referendum, where the Commission was very keen on the digital single market, and it was made as a clarion call for the next phase of the reform. And unfortunately, the UK government didn't really get a voice at the table. In fact, they wrote a letter saying we're quite happy with it. And I think it was all part of a
in which case you're going to touch,
the previous government.
The time-honoured tension or strain that runs through a great deal of European policy makers, and that is whether you're sort of on the side of the incumbents or whether you're on the side of the new entrants. and how you're going to serve the interests of both. And Britain, on balance, tends to be more knowledgeable of, more supportive towards new entrants, new technologies, new platforms. And they will say, now, come on, let's sort of get a balance here. Whereas there will be others, not least in Germany, who will say, no, ARD, those are our people. That's what we care about. We've got to protect them at all costs, and we don't want these other sort of people coming in. We want the advertising for our public service channel. We don't want these new people grabbing it all and running away with the revenue. So, Britain did have a major role to play. It did have influence, but this comes back to my basic point to you all. You are now playing in a market where you are competing with so many other economic interests and issues. You are fighting for the government's attention. You're fighting to be made a priority, to go up in the hierarchy of interests with the government. And
We are.
by the way, if you want to know more about this, as I have discovered, having read 2 excellent blogs that were put on to my own company's website last night, which I hadn't read before. A rather clever young man over there wrote them. Go to Global Council, go to the website, read these blogs, because I think you will find them very revealing in what the industry is facing.
Definitely done.
I'm
Josh,
only trying to help.
No, I know. That's the tagline of your business, isn't it? Josh, should we get the lights up, actually?
Economically.
And do come in with any questions or points or thoughts from any time from now. And don't worry about changing the subject. Josh, we kind of have to ask whether there are upsides to being free to regulate, particularly advertising in our own way. I mean, what do you think are the opportunities?
It's a tough question, actually. It is hard to see very clear opportunities unless we make a sensible deal, in which case it's possible that a global focus of the industry, which I happen to believe we already have a fairly global focus. I mean, if you listen to the previous panels, I think that we are not just working to just British sort of norms. I mean, we are making content here. We're exporting it around the world, as are our channels. So I think it probably relies on some sort of a sensible deal with the Europeans. I mean, if we make a bad deal, as it were, for the industry here, I have difficulty seeing that the markets outside of the EU are going to somehow soak up the lost opportunities of our biggest trading partners. The only potential caveats to that, China is a massive opportunity. But again, I think it's a massive opportunity for us, whether Brexit or no Brexit. I mean, again, if Brexit forces us to look at every other market outside of the EU much harder as a matter of survival, maybe we'll be that much more aggressive in opening up some of those markets, or selling better into them, or arriving at better co-production structures and ideas, and the exchange of ideas and talent. But massive opportunities. I mean, I think it's interesting to see, I don't know if you saw Matthias Döpfner, who's the CEO of Axel Springer and a board member of Time Warner, my company. He actually was interviewed by the FT and said that he thought that Britain would actually emerge stronger than Europe at the end of all of this, that Europe is going to be saddled with many of the kinds of, let's say, not as business-focused and trading-focused principles that really drove Britain's involvement in a lot of those negotiations in Brussels. And therefore, he was very pessimistic about the future for the remaining countries in the EU, and he was very optimistic about Britain, and that we would be a much more talent-focused immigration policy as well. So, I mean, that is the latest in a potential optimist who isn't, living here. but he does business. He does a lot of business in this country. So again,
he does do a lot of business, Josh, but he's also got pretty strong political views. Not that that's a crime. I have them as well. But I mean, he takes a slightly billed view of the European Union.
Yeah, definitely.
In the way that Rupert Murdoch and the editor of The Sun take a pretty Eurosceptic view. So just aim off slightly for that with Matthias. He has a real down on the EU and Europe. He thinks that Europe is just sort of slithering downhill, not saving itself, and therefore sees a great opportunity for us to break free.
Right. John, you just wanted to come in.
Yeah,
could you get the microphone to the lady? Just hold on 1 second. I'll bring you in a second.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I don't want to be doom and gloom. I mean, the UK creative industries, 58% of our export of goods and services are to the rest of the world, 42% to Europe. So we're already a global hub. Going to Josh's point, provided we get some of the fundamentals right, the world is really open to us, and also it's open to us, depending on where we net out on some of the regulations, to redesign how we support our creative industries. If the money we currently pay into Europe comes back, and it's not subject to European bureaucrats deciding how it's distributed, we can come up with better ways to distribute our money into our creative industries and more immediately and to our ends, rather than to some great idea of a pan-European, multi-territory, single co-production market. That maybe works for European commissioners. It certainly doesn't always work for British businesses.
Ideally, John,
so I think there are opportunities.
You want both. You want to secure your home market and then successfully go global.
Yeah, and also I think the other thing is the UK government right now could be looking at how it restructures support for exports. We're subject to a number of rules and regulations. The current system in what was UKTI is completely dysfunctional. We should be getting on with planning for that now, much like Steve said from NBC earlier on. Before you do a merger, plan how it's going to work when you get there. We should be doing that now, so when we do get to a point, our export support for British SMEs and the creative industries is fit for purpose.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, John, you talked about...
Could you just tell us who you are, where you're from?
My name's Sue McGinty, a small company. The free cross-border video on demand, isn't that going to affect the US more than us? And surely the EU-US trade deal would cover things like that, wouldn't it?
No, this is regulation brought in by the Commission so that free-to-air broadcasters can extend their VOD services under country of origin. So
the US selling content into Europe, wouldn't that apply to them just as much as it does us?
Absolutely, yes.
And so what are the US doing about it? What's Universal going to do in its co-productions?
I chair a UK group called UK Digital Single Market Group, and all the major US networks and studios are part of that, and that's a lobby group to try and make the case that our government hasn't been making to the European Commission about why this is detrimental. And thankfully, our colleagues in France and indeed Germany are joining in, because it is a threat to how people fund their own domestic content.
Yes, down here, gentleman there.
This is a question to Lord Mandelson.
Again, sorry, could you just tell us who you are and where you're
yes,
from?
I am Gilberto Fraz, a Portuguese veteran journalist. I'm author and commentator as well. Lord Mandelson, being Theresa May, a very, in my view, shrewd politician, and considering the Conservatives have only 2 seats majority in the Commons, and considering, as you said, being Brexit a very complex issue in peacetime, don't you think that she probably will bring elections forward before, of course, 2020?
I certainly, deeply get up every day and pray that that is the case. Bring it on, and then we can deal with the awful situation in the Labour Party earlier than 2020.
Precisely because of that.
Sorry, I'm going to move. There are other people that want to get in, forgive me, but maybe you can grab Lord Mandelson later. Yes.
Hi, Daniel Toole. I'm from IBM. I run the media and entertainment industry in Europe, but I'm also on the cross-industry IBM Brexit task force, and we do run our industry globally, but I'm in the UK P&L as an employee. I'm British. So Josh answered one of my questions, which is the priority for the industry, but if I might ask, could the panel comment on the significance of this industry And as it relates to Brexit, I think the fourth largest exporter in the UK after defence, financial services. And also the priority, how do we get up the priority list with government for that negotiation? And finally, maybe you could comment on what is the speed at which we need to conclude the negotiation. As a business person, 5 to 7 years to complete any negotiation is far too long.
I think the problem for the industry is that it's not yet properly on the radar. I mean, people think of trade in manufactured goods and the vital supply value chains which link manufacturing here with the continent, or they think of services, financial, legal, professional business services. They don't quite know where to put your product. And I would say the first thing you have to do is therefore work out your sort of tactics for getting yourself very firmly on the sort of public political radar, so that people know that you are a vital economic interest of this country, that you can't be relegated, that you have to move up in the pecking order and in the hierarchy of negotiations that is going to take place over many years, that you need to be there and need the government batting for you, rather than, as they will be faced with, countless, I mean like hundreds, thousands of different others who will be saying the same thing to them. But you're not there, in my view, yet. You've got to put yourselves up there.
I'm afraid we're almost out of time, so forgive me. Unless you could turn it into a rhetorical question that doesn't need to be put to the panel. Do you want to make a last? Do you want to have the last word? Whoever's got the microphone over there. Who took it?
I just had a question for Lord Mandelson. As Toby Chapman
you won't get an answer, I'm afraid, because we've got 45 seconds.
Maybe a very quick answer.
Make a point. Yeah, go on. Go on.
Go on.
Have a go.
36 seconds.
What's the question?
No? Go on? All right, don't worry. Sorry about that. Look, before you go into coffee, could you go to your app and rank... Well, basically, what we want you to do is rank the issues in order across that app. Now, unfortunately, we wanted to do it straight away and then give you a pretty instantaneous answer, but you've got to log in, apparently, so you need a username and password, which is being emailed to you when you open that app or when you register for it. It'd be great if you could do that over coffee and vote in the next few minutes, if you can, on that app, and then we'll bring you the results of that after the coffee break. It would be really good to get a sense of this room's priorities in terms of a headline, in terms of what you want government to look at as it goes into the negotiation. So thank you very much indeed for doing that in advance, and can I ask you to thank the panel.